right, everyone, it is now noon. My name is Megan Purdue. I am the ag agent in Worcester County, Maryland. A lot of the emails, the reminders, and the registration links are coming from me. This is the first in our series of Monday Moves seminars. These are brought to you by our beef and cattle educators. Most of them are out in Western Maryland. If you scroll up to the top of the chat box, I've posted the link for the Backyard Farming webpage on there. That lists our entire series. The rest of the cattle sessions are listed there with their registration link. So if you've only registered for this one, you want to go back and register for the other ones. Those are there. We also have a What the Hay series on Wednesdays that started last Wednesday, but we have 3 more sessions coming up with that, and that is taught by our pasture and forage specialist. So if you want to see what else we are offering as part of the series, feel free to visit that web page. You can enter any questions in the chat box, and we will go through them at the end of the session. But at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Sarah Potts to introduce everyone and introduce you to the series.
All right, thanks, Megan. And thanks everyone for tuning in today. My name is Sarah Potts. I'm the Dairy and Beef Extension Specialist for Maryland Extension. I've been in this position for a little over a year now, and my expertise is mostly in nutrition and animal care and management. As part of our beef team, we also have Jeff Semler, who will be talking to you today, and then also Rachel Slatterly. So she is also in Dairy and Beef Extension, but she works in the Department of Animal Science down in College Park. So all 3 of us are going to be on the call today and answering any questions. But Jeff's going to be talking to you today. He's our extension agent for Washington County, Maryland, and he has extensive knowledge in cattle, both beef and dairy. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jeff, and he's going to talk to you about why you want to raise cattle.
All right, there we go. As soon as I got myself unmuted, we're in good shape. So as Sarah said, I'm Jeff Semler. I'm the Extension Educator or Agent in Washington County, Maryland. I've been in Washington County all my life. I'm one of those folks that have raised cattle, started out in 4-H, raised beef steers. We've raised all different kinds of cattle over the years. Certainly, what we're going to talk about today is we're going to go a mile wide and an inch deep. So this is just the introduction. And don't let anything that we talk about today scare you, because we'll have more details as this series goes on. So why are we doing this? Certainly since the COVID-19 crisis, many U.S. households are exploring growing their own food. And those with some sort of a land base are looking at livestock of some kind, whether it be poultry, lambs, cattle, whatever. So we're going to talk about cattle today. So begin with the end in mind. What's your goal? Are you going to raise animals for meat? Are you going to raise them for milk and meat? Or are you just raising them because you're tired of mowing that extra acreage? So we're going to talk a little bit about all those things. And like I said, we're going to go over this in very broad terms, but feel free to ask any questions that you like. So before you start, you need to know about zoning and neighbors. In Washington County, and I don't know where any of you are from, but I can't speak to other areas. I can only speak to Washington County. But if you live in a rural part of Washington County, in other words, not in an incorporated town, you can raise livestock. Even if you live in a development, you can raise livestock as long as your deed doesn't have any covenant restrictions on it that keep you from raising livestock. In Washington County, for example, a lot of our developments will say if you've got 3 acres or more, you can raise farm animals. Usually the only exclusion of that would be pigs. Lots of times places allow horses almost everywhere, and then cattle, sheep, chickens, and so on. You should start planning at least 6 months in advance. That will help you kind of sort out what you have, what you need, and what it's going to cost you, and are you willing to pay that, and so on and so forth. You need to think about housing. One thing to remember about housing, except for bottle calves, barns were built for people. There's not a great deal of housing requirement for cattle, other than if you're going to have to handle them, get them in, that's a little bit different. But as far as do they need a barn, the answer is no. Do they need shelter and shade? The answer is yes. And we won't dwell on that a lot, but we'll talk a little bit about it. Feed and water is one of those things that's often overlooked, but a fresh, clean supply of water is necessary for cattle, as well as feed. And then what's your time commitment? How much do you want to spend doing this job? And then biosecurity and disease is going to be the last thing we touch on a little bit. So you have to remember you need to give provision for feed, water, and space, regardless of what system you're going to use. You're going to need to have a little bit of acreage when we're talking about cattle. And we're not going to talk about breeds a lot today, but there's lots of different sizes of cattle. So you can go from the smaller Dexter cattle to, great, big, large Charolais, if you like, or Holstein, but we're going to just stay away from breeds a lot today. So there's different production systems. You can raise a calf from start to finish. In other words, you can buy that bottle calf at the local stockyard, and you can raise it on milk, wean it, feed it, and finish it all the way to the freezer. You can buy some calves in May, background them all summer to eat that grass that you don't want to mow, and you can sell them in the fall. Or you can buy a calf, that same calf, either in the spring or the fall. In our location here in Washington County, and certainly in most of the Mid-Atlantic, most of our cows calve in the spring, so that weaned calf is going to be bought in the fall. But again, that's going to be a decision you can are going to have to look at on down the line. And then you can always have a cow-calf operation. Buy one cow that's pregnant, calve her out, raise her calf, eat the calf, milk the cow, or don't milk the cow, let the calf do the milking. So we're going to touch on all those different types of systems. And you can hybridize any of these systems as you wish. So care and housing of a baby calf, you're going to purchase the calf. The question is, are we going to buy it at the sale barn, or are we going to buy it at the from a local producer? Obviously, there's pluses and minuses to both those systems. You go to the sale barn, you're going to have a lot more selection. You may buy that cute calf. We sell feeder calves in another part of my life. And I always tell people that I never want to sell a single calf because they're not going to bring the highest price unless some little girl is sitting next to her grandfather and she wants that calf. And granddad will pay whatever it takes to bring that calf home. Otherwise, the calf is not going to go for a high price. You need to think about what you're going to use as far as shed, a barn, or a hutch when rearing this calf. You're going to be feeding it with a bottle. It is a great activity to do with children. You can see my grandson there feeding a calf. It's a great way to teach responsibility. It's a great way to, again, to start out. You're going to be mixing that feed or powdered milk unless you've got your cow. And you're going to be mixing that calf starter, the powdered milk or milk replacer, as we call it, is expensive. It's about $65 a bag. It'll take you about 2 bags to raise a calf, roughly. Then you're going to go transition that animal from pasture. You're going to provide hay and grain to it as well. We'll talk more about calf rearing, but basically before you wean that calf, you want it to be eating about 1.5 pounds or 2 pounds of grain a day. Feed cost is going to be the #1 cost. The calf is not going to be that expensive. We'll delve into the economics later in this presentation. The time frame is it's gonna take you about 18 months to 2 years, depending on how hard you want to push that calf to gain. So that's your time commitment when it comes to that calf. Backgrounding is one of those options. It's going to be shorter. It's basically going to be, you're going to start in grass season, so April or May, you're going to buy those animals. You're going to move them across your pasture. You're going to your earning is going to be based on gain, and it's going to reduce your time on the lawnmower. So I would say here, you're just basically reducing your time on the lawnmower, and your hope is that at the end of the summer, September, October, you sell that calf at a profit. A small profit, but nonetheless a profit. You could also take that calf all the way through to finish, and we'll talk about that also a little later. But there's options there. The one thing I also want to remember to mention is we often talk about pasture, and many people think in the back of their mind that pasture is free. Pasture is not free. You may think it's free, but remember, pasture includes fencing, and if you're going to be rotating your grazing, it's going to include cross fencing. It's going to include a watering system or a way to get the animals back to water. And then you also have the initial cost of the land. Now you may say, well, I already bought the land. I bought my house in 7 acres. That cost is already done. Okay, I'll give you that one. But maybe you don't have the land and you're renting the lot next door or down the road or so on and so forth. So remember that pasture is not free. There's also inputs when it comes to fertilizer and weed control and other maintenance. So there is a cost to pasture, but owning it is certainly an advantage. You can decide to finish a calf. You could take that same calf that you bought last spring if you're going to background it. You could feed it for about 200-ish days. It's a moderate term. In other words, it's not a whole year. It's not just the summer. It's kind of in between. There is a higher cost for that calf. There will be a lower cost for the feed. So we'll talk about those in depth here in just a few minutes when we get into the economics of it. You can also go into the cow-calf business. You can have a year, but you want to remember here we have year-round cow care. So read here cow cost, milking versus calf rearing. Do you want to provide some milk to your table? You can milk, or you can just let the calf suckle, or you can do a combination of those. You can milk maybe 1 day a week or every other morning or whatever, and you can let the calf take the rest of the milk. Those are all options for you. There is a moderate feed cost because you will have winter feed costs for the cow and the calf. If you're going to raise the calf all the way through to slaughter, you will have a breeding cost. Again, if you have 1 or maybe 2 cows on the place, you're not going to buy a bull. You're going to need the services of an inseminator, and that will be a cost. Some places it's very difficult to find that person. Some places it may only be a local veterinarian, but again, you're going to need to think about that when you go down this road. Whoops. That's that slide shouldn't be in there. So selecting a calf. Again, I already said you can go to the sale barn or a breeder. Dairy versus beef. There's lots of people in this country that eat Holstein beef and don't know it. So don't let a dairy breed be shying away from the prospects of raising beef. Most of the time it's going to be a little more difficult to buy a beef calf unless someone has an orphan calf that they're selling, or there are dairy farmers that are crossing with beef. So you get a calf that may be solid black like the calf in the picture, but his mama may be a Holstein or a Jersey or Guernsey or some other beef dairy breed. But just because the sire was an Angus, he looks boot black. So remember, there may be crosses in there, but don't fear the breed. They will do a good job of Holstein will typically finish out a little larger when we get to the end point, so it may be more days on feed, but certainly an animal that will eat very well. So the calf husbandry, if we're going to go that way with buying a calf, we're going to twice a day feed it for 2 to 3 months. We're going to almost from day one, we're going to allow that calf to have access to grain and access to clean, fresh water. So you notice that hutch, this is a hutch system. The pink bucket has grain in it, the white bucket has water in it. And we make sure that they have access to that all the time. We're going to feed them twice a day. We typically are going to start them, depending on the size of the calf, you're going to start them out at about half a gallon per feeding. That will depend again on the size of the calf you get and so on. We're then going to transition that animal from just the milk and grain to hay, and then hay and or pasture. We may never stop feeding grain. We may, it will be up to the producer. There is a time when you can just grow along that animal on pasture and hay. But again, if you want to move things along faster, grain will help with the gain. But again, that will be, you're going to have to balance your cost. There's certainly nothing wrong with backgrounding your own calf on pasture and hay, and then bringing it in and finishing it in the traditional, more traditional grain system. So somehow I missed a slide, didn't advance properly. So backgrounding, we're going to just graze them. You're going to buy those calves in the spring. You're going to just graze them across that pasture. You may need to supplement with grain or hay depending on the amount of animals you have and the amount of pasture you have. Whether the weather cooperates, or you're going to get enough rain for regrowth. You're going to have to remember fencing here. Fencing is going to be very important to you. It's going to best work if you can move your animals or rotate, give the pasture some rest, as opposed to continuous grazing. You'll be able to carry more animals on the same amount of acres versus continuous grazing. In other words, just turning them out on all your grass. It will also, the number of animals will depend on how many acres you have and how big of calves you get. You want to think about it, 1,000 pound of animal or animal unit is going to be about an acre is going to be needed. So if you get 2 500-pound calves, you're going to need an acre plus. If you get 2 300-pound calves, then you're going to need less land. You can also, again, we're going to have to play that with supplementation, because most of the time we think about 1,000 pounds of animal or animal units requiring 2 acres for feeding, whether that be grass, a grass mixture with clovers, or if it's going to be grass and hay. Okay, so now finishing. You bought that calf in the summer. You've decided to graze it all summer. Now you're going to feed it intensively, so you're going to bring it in probably in the winter, maybe November. You still may allow it to have access to pasture for exercise, but you're going to be feeding primarily hay and grain. The grain and hay is going to be much more increased than it was on pasture. So you're going to be feeding that basically about 2% of the body weight in hay and grain. So if you've got an 800-pound steer, you're going to be feeding about 2% of that body weight in hay and grain. Again, remembering that both hay and grain dry matter is about 90%. So it's not quite a pound per pound. But again, you're going to be feeding about 16 pounds of feed, roughly, or dry matter, I should say. So probably somewhere around 20 pounds, 10 pounds of hay, 10 pounds of grain. And you're going to be moving that up as the calf grows. You're probably going to change your ratio of hay to grain. We want to keep a little hay in the system because cattle are ruminants and they need that hay for digestion. but you can certainly increase the amount of grain as the increase in size of your steer. So the cow-calf operation would look something like this. Any hybrid of that, we're going to graze the cow. We're going to feed her a little grain, primarily as a tool for behavior, but also maybe to give her a little boost in her milk production. We're going to have to feed her hay in the wintertime. We're going to need fencing, and we're going to need a shed, somewhere we can milk that cow if we're going to milk her. If we're not going to milk her, we just really need a shed to bring her in. Again, we want that behavioral aspect of being able to handle the animal. So a little, I call the grain bait, if you will, but you're going to move that animal into the shed just for handling reasons. There may be times you need to doctor the cow or the calf, so you need to get them into the shed. The shed can be an open fronted shed, 3-sided. It's really going to provide shade and a windbreak. Those are the two things you're going to need most with cattle. You don't want to stress them with heat, and you certainly don't want, in the wintertime, you want to have a place where they can get out of wind. Wind is our main concern in the wintertime. A still day, no matter what the temperature, unless it's below 20 degrees, a cow is perfectly comfortable if it's well fed. But we want to remember, we want that animal to be able to get out of the wind, and certainly a rain and wind event. So the cost involved, we're going to start with backgrounding, since that's one of the place you might actually make a little money at this. You buy a 500-pound weaned calf for $1.50 or $750. They're on grass for 150 days. You gain about 2 pounds a day, 1.5 pounds to 2 pounds. You sell an 800-pound calf for $1.40, and you can see what your net is. Well, that's return to labor and management. That is not free. That is, you've spent time, you've got fence involved there. That difference between your input or your cost of your calf and your sale price of your calf is not free game. You paid, you have some things involved. Maybe you decided you wanted to go to a beach for a week and you paid the neighbor kid to look after your calf. That cost is in there as well, will have to be taken out of there as well. All right. So cost of calfing. Now we're going to get into these are average figures, or not. I'm not saying this is what it's going to cost you. I'm saying this is what it's could cost you. So we have a calf. We bought at the sale barn. That calf was a 100-pound calf. We were able to get it for $100. We were lucky. We have $130 worth of milk replacer in that calf. We have about $220 worth of hay in that calf, and about $230 worth of grain in that calf. So by the time that calf, we get that calf to what would normally in a beef system be a weaning time, about between 200 and 300 days, we've got about $580 in that calf. And again, these are just average figures. You might be able to get your grain cheaper. You might be able to get your hay cheaper. We'll talk about that in a little bit, about how we can make things a little bit cheaper. So let's say you bought that calf that's 700 pounds or 800 pounds and you're going to feed it out. This is what it would cost for the 200 days on grain and hay. It would cost you about $440, or if you had that calf that we just talked about, we're going to have about $580 plus $440. So roughly, we're going to have somewhere around $1,000 in that calf. So here's what it would look like if you were going to cost it out as beef. So you have your cost of that steer, that 800-pound steer. You've got your startup cost. That's an average of what you pay to get it hauled there, and some other things, maybe a vet check. You got your feed, you got other, I'm sorry, there's your vet check, and you've got your processing. So your 500 pounds of beef you got out of that steer is cost you $5.32 per pound. And you say, well, that's more than the average price of hamburger. Not now, but you know, hamburger used to trade at about $3.50, $4 a pound. But you'll never buy a T-bone steak for $5.32. So you have to look at the whole carcass, look at all your cuts at $5.32 a pound for the whole steer. Again, you could sell half of that steer to your sister-in-law or your neighbor and then cut your costs a little bit, but that's one of your many options you have in the system. If we go to a cow-calf system, you've got the initial cost of the cow. So you could forward, or I said you could rewind this presentation. You could buy a baby heifer calf. You could raise her up. You could breed her. At 2 years, you would have your first calf. So all those costs that we've already talked about would be in that mama cow. You could buy a cow from maybe a dairy farmer that's got a cow that she breeds back, but she's not a great milk producer. Maybe you could get her for a good price. Maybe you have a friend that's selling some beef cows and they've got a cow that they're not really fond of, but she's pregnant. She'll have a calf for you. She's done all right. Not the top of the line, but not a call. So you'll have that initial cost. That could be anywhere. Again, you're paying call price from $600 to $1,200 to $1,400 for that cow initially. You're going to have the breeding cost annually, and you're going to have the cost of the cow in addition to the cost of the calf. So that's roughly about $300 a year of feed cost for your cow, plus all those costs we've already talked about with your calf. Now again, here we have a Holstein cow. She's obviously been crossed with a Hereford bull, and she's got a beef cross calf that she's nursing. That works perfectly well. Lots of people do those kind of things. You could also have that cow. Maybe you have a neighbor that his cow died and you were able to get his Hereford calf, and you could graft that calf onto your cow. That would be another option for you, certainly. One thing you want to remember as a cattleman, now that you've joined the ranks, is you need to study your animals daily for signs of disease, discomfort, whether eating their feed, whether consuming water. You'll learn your animals as you go through this process. You'll get to know them. They'll get to know you. You'll walk out into the pasture. They'll come towards you. You'll be able to make some decisions about the health of the animal. We always want that animal to be bright-eyed. We want them to be, look very well, not a lot of diarrhea. Now, again, when they're on grass, their manure can be very loose, especially in the spring. But we want to look at their hair coat. We just want to make sure that they're in good shape. You'll be able to discern when there's a problem. Once you learn your animals, there won't be any problem with that. You'll need to understand working with live animals that may have special needs. In other words, you may have a calf that gets pink eye. You may have a cow that gets a sore foot. Those kind of things need your care as well as veterinary care. So you're going to need to develop a relationship with a large animal veterinarian. You're going to want to have that person out. Again, develop a working relationship. It can't always be a cold call. You need to make sure you know your veterinarian, they know you, and that way when you call, you won't necessarily get to the bottom of the list. Culling is a part of your job. There may be a time when you have to sell, if you're in the cow-calf business, that you've got to sell that cow and replace her. There may be a poor doing calf. For some reason, it gets pneumonia early on. It never does right. You may have to sell that calf and start over. It is a part of the system. You have to look at it that way. You have to really think of it as it's a part of the job. It's not something that we all like to do, but it is something that we have to do. The last thing we want to talk about, and I didn't put it in writing here, but sometimes, as my college professor once said, if you have livestock, sooner or later you're going to have dead stock. And so what are we going to do to dispose of mortality? In every county that I can think of in Maryland, with the exception of Howard, I believe, it is completely acceptable to bury dead, as long as it's not, in your septic drainage field, or it's not buried in a watershed, a low water table where you're going to contaminate a well. My preferred disposal of mortality is composting. Yes, you can compost a cow. It does take about 6 months and a lot of wood chips, but it can be done. There's no longer the dead man that comes around and picks up calls or deads anymore. There is a possibility, if you may have a local pet crematorium, they may, for a substantial fee, I'm sure, consider a cremation, but that would be your only other option. So I showed you the economic cost of the endeavor. There are intrinsic benefits and drawbacks to raising your own beef. Raising and steer can be a good way, as I said, to teach children responsibilities for an animal dependent upon them for their food and water, or in your case, if you don't have children, dependent on you. What's going into the product, so you know the end product. It's something that you can take pride in. You can take pride in the fact that you've raised some of your own food, and there's a certain amount of shall I say, catharsis that raising, for me anyway. I enjoy watching my cows. I enjoy, interacting with them, and that's certainly not anything you can put a price tag on. You certainly want to remember that there are costs and there are rewards. On the other hand, there's a large time commitment. There's a large space commitment. You're going to be feeding that animal twice a day, checking the water and monitoring the health. It's more intensive than a dog or a cat. A steer and its facilities also take up a lot more space. There's certainly that cost of, a dog kennel is one cost, but a cow shed's another cost. And once you've made that investment, sometimes it's harder to walk away from it. But sometimes that may be what you need to do. Raising your own freezer beef or not, that's going to be your choice, but it's certainly something that you can consider. There's again, you can make a little money. You can certainly won't make a lot of money at it. Your best hope is to break even and eat well. So lastly, we'll get to the part that no one likes to do, and that's keeping records. They're important. They're a good reference. How did I do last year? What do I need to change to do better this year? Am I making any progress when it comes to that? Keeping track of expenses. It's often times when we have, especially with multiple enterprises, we don't always keep track of the expenses the way we should. Maybe we have a big garden and our chickens and our steer, and we lump all those costs and incomes together. We don't really see where our profit centers are. Again, we're not really worried about making a lot of profit, but as the last statement says, hobbies can be expensive, but they can be rewarding. Again, the other thing that I didn't cost out for you is if you're going to have a beef and you're going to provide that beef all at one time, you're going to need a large freezer. So that's another expense that we sometimes often don't think about, or don't think about until it's too late. And the butcher calls and says, I've got your beef ready. And you say, where am I going to put 500 pounds of beef? So you need to think about those things as well. But certainly, I believe that raising livestock can be very rewarding, and it can be very educational, and it'll make you appreciate where your food comes from. At this point in time, I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. I'm sure someone's keeping track of those, and you can let me know what's what.
All right, thanks, Jeff. We have a couple questions. One question was, does it make economic sense to buy calves in the fall when prices are a little cheaper and overwinter them in hay feed?
It certainly does on certain occasions. The question is, what's your cost of hay? And can you background those animals in that fall wintertime period on pasture at all? If you can stockpile fescue, you can do that. The other thing, I didn't touch on it and meant to touch on it, I'm glad you asked the question, is the best time to buy hay is at harvest. So if your neighbors are harvesting hay right now, now's the best time to buy your hay. Yes, you will need a place to store it. It would be best if you could store it inside or under roof as opposed to somewhere, out in a fence row. But know that if you do store it outside, you're going to lose about 20 to 30% of that hay to wastage, depending on the amount of time that you are storing it. But again, it can be done, and certainly you will be able to buy cattle sometimes, most of the time, cheaper in the fall. They'll be lighter weight, but they will be cheaper than what we call the grass calves in the spring, when everyone's looking for calves, and calves can top the market.
Another question was, can you explain what is involved with composting cattle?
Sure. Basically, you're going to think about making friends with a tree trimmer. You're going to need a lot of wood chips. Would be my preferred substrate to use to compost the cow, but basically you're going to put about 2 feet of roughly of chips on the ground. You're going to place the cow on top of the chips, and then you're going to cover her with about 2 feet of chips all the way around. And you'll be able to tell very soon if you don't get her covered well, because she'll start to smell. But if you cover her well, it can be static. You can just let her lay there. The composting process, she's the nitrogen part of the composting. The chips are the carbon part of the composting. In about 6 months, you'll still have some long bones left, like maybe the pelvis, the femur, the jawbone, but a lot of the cow will be gone. If you can turn her at that point in time, in other words, if you've got a front end loader, you can mix your compost up, maybe add a little more chips. You can certainly have a finished compost in somewhere around 9 months. You can also speed up the composting process by basically opening up the cow's abdomen.
One other question was, can you talk a little bit about the economics of using AI if you're just raising freezer beef?
Sure. Typically, if you live in an area where there's an inseminator that's breeding cows, or probably breeding the dairy farms in your neighborhood, you can get an inseminator plus the semen for about $30. Now you're going to have to watch for heats, and you're going to have to call the inseminator when the cow's in heat. If you want to utilize the synchronization program, it's going to cost you a little bit more, and you're going to have to get involved with your veterinarian. So if you could get a cow safe in calf for between $50 and $100, depending on depending on your ability to check heat. Once your inseminator is well versed in this, so he won't be a problem usually. It'll be your heat detection if there's an issue. And I said he, but that inseminators come in both genders. Matter of fact, there's at least one person on this call that's a pretty good breeder.
Thanks for that clarification. I don't see any other questions. If anybody has any other questions, please put them in the chat box. And then I know Megan just put another poll up as well.
As the second poll is going now, be sure to sign up for next week's Monday Moo. I think we're talking about all about calves next week.